Hello there, everyone. Welcome to the Wizard of Radical Self-Respect. Today will be interview number 14 with Ellen Busch. She is the author of Disempowered. It's actually a pretty cool story that she has, and we've shared some similar struggles and also some similar solutions to those struggles, too. I always like to focus on the solutions. But Ellen, thank you very much for joining me today. How are you?
I'm great, and thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
My pleasure. So let's start at the beginning. You have dyslexia.
hmm
And if anyone out there is like me, they don't really know what dyslexia is.
Right.
What the heck is going on? Are people texting me? I'm sorry.
Oh, that's
But
okay.
yeah, if they're anything like me, they don't know what dyslexia is. And some people use it as a throwaway term, like, oh, I'm dyslexic. So you
Right.
don't really know if they're serious or not. So could you describe for us and explain to us what dyslexia even is?
The simple answer or the conventional answer is that it is today considered a learning disability.
Okay.
It is protected under the Americans with Disability Act, and it is often associated with delayed ability to learn, to read, and also often with reversing numbers and words and letters.
Okay.
That's the common assumption or understanding would probably be a better word.
Okay. And so how does that present itself in like what are the symptoms of that?
In majority of cases, it's slow or delayed reading.
Okay.
And it can also be associated with late learning to talk. And in my case, a speech impediment. So I actually had difficulty pronouncing the letter S and had to go through
Okay.
quite a bit of speech therapy.
So that's how it can come off too. It can come off as mispronunciation of words. Like
Correct.
are particular letters usually a problem for people or it just depends on the person?
I think it depends on the person. You know, dyslexia is like so many other neurodiverse things. There's always a spectrum or a range, and it can show up differently for different people.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's the other thing I wanted to mention too. Dyslexia, part of the neurodivergent umbrella. So there's a lot of things under the neurodivergent umbrella these days. So dyslexia, ADHD. I even think narcissism and like borderline is considered neurodivergent. People on the spectrum, all of those things, all of the clusters, I believe are all neurodivergent too. Perhaps if I'm wrong about that, someone can mention. But I think all of those things fall under neurodivergence now.
I believe you are correct. I'm just not very knowledgeable about those particular topics.
No worries.
Yeah.
So, when did you first notice in your own life that there was an issue, that there was something up?
Sure. So actually, I was diagnosed at a very young age. And initially, I was diagnosed as ambidextrous,
Okay.
which is very uncommon. And that is a very key point that I will come back to. Um, and in the process of further testing, I was given what's called the WIST test, which is the standardized test. And it was determined at that point that I was dyslexic. Now, the reason why the ambidextrous piece of it is so important is the belief at that time when I went through the school system. And I grew up in Westchester County, New York.
Oh, okay. Not too
And
far from me.
yeah, so, and you know, it's an affluent community and the schools are very, very good. People make an effort to move into those communities for the schools. And unfortunately, like I was saying, the belief system at that time was that if you were ambidextrous, you didn't have a dominant eye. And if you didn't have a dominant eye, you couldn't learn to read. So I was actually
Hmm.
held back until the end of second grade before they even let me begin to learn to read.
Now, I thought ambidextrous was being able to use both hands
Mhm.
equally. I
Yes.
didn't realize that had anything to do with a dominant eye. Or does it have anything to do with that? And they just
I,
thought it did.
I believe it does. And in my case, I have recently learned that I actually have what's called cross dominance.
Okay.
I am left-handed, and one would expect my left eye to be dominant, but in my case, my right eye is actually dominant.
I have that too, actually, now that you mention it. So like when you like cover one eye and you point, you
Yeah,
see which part of your finger is still where you pointed.
yeah.
So I'm right-handed, but my left eye is dominant as well.
And I'm the exact opposite of you. So,
Okay, very
yeah.
interesting. So answer me this too.
Mhm.
Why do they think if you're one-eyed dominant, you wouldn't be able to read?
At that time, now we're going back many years, we're talking about the 70s, to be
Yeah,
honest.
yeah.
That was just where the science was at the time. That's what the belief was. And it was because of the idea of being able to track words across a page.
Okay.
So, and as far as I know, that belief is pretty much debunked at this point.
Yeah, I would think so. I have a hard time imagining why they even thought that to begin with. It's like you'd think people can read with one eye. I don't even know where they came up with that from.
I believe me, I'm right there with you. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
So basically, that's how it presented itself for you. And
right.
then at what age about did the bullying begin?
Oh, it started right around the same time because I was removed from the regular classroom and sent to a separate classroom for special help. In addition to that, I had a lisp. So I had a target painted on my back.
Right.
I was fortunate enough that my parents had a summer home on Fire Island, and we used to spend our summers there. So, which was absolutely wonderful and was a lifesaver for me to get away from that community, but also meant that I never had a chance to fully integrate into that community.
Right.
I always felt like a little bit of an outsider.
Sure. Sure.
So,
Because I know kids, especially back then, kids were super mean
mhm.
and super cruel. And I think a lot of times they get it from their parents, a lot of times I think. But there's also been a lot of research recently that says, like, people used to always think bullies just have low self esteem. But there's actually research pointing to the contrary now, where it's actually they have too much belief in themselves and they just like poking on people. So
Right.
there's been some new literature about that I thought,
It's
people
interesting.
wouldn't like to think that, but I thought it was pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, it's the exact opposite of what we've been told.
Right.
So,
And that's exactly who the guy who told me about it. That's
mhm.
exactly what he said. He was a psychologist and he says, yeah, all this information about bullying now, I think it's because everyone wants to think that they don't feel good about themselves because what person who feels good about themselves would ever want to be treating people poorly?
Be cruel. Yeah.
Right. And the
Yeah.
whole point of his thing was actually there's really just people that have bad character that are just like bad people and they can feel great about themselves, but that
Mhm.
still doesn't mean they don't like making other people feel bad too. Like or,
Right.
or are bad to begin with, I should say. So it's
Right.
just interesting to note. Like I think some people are bullies
Yeah.
because they feel bad about themselves, but there are certainly people who feel good about themselves too that are just jerks. People don't like the idea of there just being jerks,
Mhm.
but I do think there are just jerks out there.
Yeah. And there are worse. There are,
Oh,
and as you know, you follow Mark Devine's teachings. He talks a lot about the wolves,
oh yeah,
the predators.
they're out there.
So they are out there.
They're out there, and you got to watch out for them because
Mhm.
if people are too much like the innocent lamb, they will certainly take advantage of you. And
Oh,
that's how I've seen it.
it's what exactly happened to me.
Yeah. So, was there like a culmination of the bullying that you went through? And then a side question to that, you could talk about the academics and how they pigeonholed you and your diagnosis into not being able to perform as well as you could or not giving you the opportunities.
Well, it was kind of all the above.
Okay.
On one hand, I'm contending with these bullies who are just, determined to make my life miserable and be cruel.
All right.
They went out of their way to be cruel. And then I'm trying to cope with not being able to keep up with my classmates academically, and then being sent off to another classroom or another part of the school for the individualized help. So there's that piece of it. And I struggled. I struggled. I had to work twice as hard as everybody else. Now, in my situation, I got really lucky because I got the 1,000,001 parents.
Hmm.
My parents were actually sat down in a parent-teacher conference, and they were told college was out of the question. I might finish high school. Um, it was the 70s, and a lot of moms, a lot of wives didn't work.
Right.
So my parents were told they should focus on finding me a husband to take care of me because I would not be contributing to society.
Oh.
Yeah, that parent teacher conference ended with my mother pounding her fist on the desk saying, "I refuse to allow you to condemn my daughter."
Can you imagine? I mean, even if someone even tried to do that today, they
Mhm,
would probably be fired,
mhm.
uh, almost condemned with like systemic abuse or something. It
Or
goes to
maybe
show you it's
sued.
changed a lot in the last what is
Yeah,
this, 50 years or so.
yeah. And fortunately for me, because I had amazing parents, they went to work. My mom was a stay-at-home mom, but that was her choice. She had had a very successful career. In fact, she had been the highest ranked and highest paid woman in Volkswagen in the late 50s and early 60s before she met my father.
Right.
So she was a very capable executive. And those teachers had no idea what they were going to be up against. So she got involved in every part of my school. She was a class mom. She was on the trips. She was involved in every way that she could be involved. And then my dad was my cheerleader. And my dad had been an Army veteran, and he understood the value of learning outside the classroom. And he used to say to me all the time when I would be struggling with my homework, "You can do it, Ellen. You know you can do it. Prove him wrong. Prove it wrong." Any of that sound a little bit like Mark Devine?
Absolutely.
So at a very early age, I really had tremendous support from both of my parents. And then, and this is, I'm probably leading you a little bit, but my dad also understood the value of learning through challenge. And at a very early age, he had me out there doing challenging things. So,
Good. I
yeah.
mean, what those people were doing to you, like in the school administration, I guess it was, like
Yep.
that stuff is a double whammy because they put these self-imposed limits on people
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
self-imposed, I guess, ceilings, and
Yeah.
they're like a curse
Hmm.
as well. And
Yeah.
like people's mindset, as you know, is so important. So when people
Hmm.
put that spell curse on you of a negative mindset, it does so much damage. And that's
Hmm.
what like I am different than a lot of the medical people out there. Where I hate people who do that, like pigeonhole you into something. Oh, it has to be this, it has to be that. It's like
Right.
I'm very hesitant to say anything exactly like that. And you mentioned your parents, or in particular your dad. He would like you to overcome challenges. And I think
Hmm.
that's a big part of growing up too and gaining wisdom, where they say the calm sea never made a skilled sailor.
Right.
That's something I think a lot of kids are missing out on these days because their
Hmm.
parents, they take care of all the obstacles for them. They call them like the
Hmm.
snowplow parents or the helicopter parents,
Yeah.
and we falsely or wrongly believe that if they just make their kids' life easier, oh, they won't have any trauma and they'll just be like free and clear to be happy and blissful. But to
Right.
me, it's actually the opposite. It's like, no, you're handcuffing them so that when life happens to them, which it inevitably will, it's going to
Hmm.
punch them in the face and they're not going to know what to do. They're not going to have the perseverance to be able to overcome those challenges. And that's the gift that
Hmm.
your dad gave to you and your
Yes.
mom too, for that matter, because that's
Yes.
what it is. It's a
Hmm.
gift, really.
Hmm. I agree with you 1,000%.
Right.
And my dad used to give me really hard chores, like stacking firewood.
Yeah, there you go.
And I was like, "Dad, it's hard." And we had this kind of ongoing joke. And he'd say, "Oh, it'd be good for you. Put hair on your chest." And I'd put my hands on my hips and look up at him. And I'd say, "But Daddy, I'm a girl."
And what would he say to that?
He said, "You know what? Doesn't matter. Good for you anyway. Go do it." So
I think, yeah, I bet you people are even less likely to tell their daughters to do something like that today. Maybe a mother would, maybe like a single mother would tell her daughter to do that. But a lot of guys, they treat their daughters like the little princess. So they're not going to want to, oh, have her go like chop firewood or do something like that. It's just kind of
right.
against what they believe.
Yeah, well, and I can give you a bunch of other examples too. I was running and piloting his boat. I used to have to stand on a 5-gallon bucket upside down so I could get my hands on the steering wheel and see the compass and the bow. So he was teaching me all of those skills. At 15, he sent me on Outward Bound. At 17, he sent me to go get certified to scuba dive. And I wanted to do all of those things. I was incredibly excited to do those things. But those were just more examples of, learning through challenge.
Right. So how exactly did you learn to work with your dyslexia?
I learned to turn my anger and frustration into determination.
Okay, that's a good
And,
formula.
yeah, and that leads to perseverance. So it was a combination of learning through all these challenges while out, with dad and Outward Bound and things like that. And then having that parental support. You can do it, Ellen, you can do it.
Right.
And then just really being supported to take that anger and focus it into determination.
So a couple of things that made me think of. One, they say your parents' voice to you when you're growing up becomes your inner voice as an adult. Now, for some people, that's a great thing. For you, it seems like it was a great thing.
Thank God.
But for other people, it's like the opposite. And they have
Right.
this negative, critical self-talk that they got to deprogram or reprogram out of themselves. That's one. The second thing it made me think of was this meme that I've seen floating around, and I made a video about it too, but it said something along the lines of, my trauma didn't make me stronger. It gave me memory issues, mental health issues, intimacy issues, and just basically all of these negative things.
Right.
And to me, even though it can do some of those things, absolutely, I just think that's the terrible formula. What you said is a good formula, right? You put a positive spin on what happened to you, because what choice do we have? What would be the alternative, right? In the ideal world, maybe there would be none of that heartbreak, trauma, whatever. But once you've experienced it, there's no going back. So why not try to make the best of it? And I want to correct myself too. I said in the ideal world there'd be no trauma. I mean, a world without trauma, there's no obstacles to overcome in a world without trauma. Now, of course, there's certainly varying degrees, right? I wouldn't say to like someone who's lost a child to an overdose or something. It's like, oh yeah, it was good you had that trauma there, and it's good to overcome that. It's like, no, of course not.
All right.
Of course not. But in terms of just overall building character and strength, some of that trauma, not the worst thing.
Right. It certainly has made me very, very strong. And it has taught me how capable I am. Now, with that said, and to your points of what you've just said, I did have to do a lot of work on healing, and did work with a licensed therapist, and did a lot of EMDR work. And I'm still doing EMDR work because I'm still uncovering things. But I like to say we are energetic onions.
The layers.
We're always healing another layer.
Yeah, there you go.
Finding something else.
Like Donkey from Shrek.
Right. And I think that a lot of people don't understand also is that at some point, if you have the opportunity or seek out healing, it stops becoming about the trauma and starts becoming a journey of self-discovery.
Absolutely.
And that's when it gets really exciting.
And I think that's just a good way to spin it too, right? So you had that trauma, but then it becomes an opportunity to work on yourself. It becomes an opportunity to do some digging through those layers. And perhaps that's something you wouldn't have had the opportunity to do if not for some of those quote unquote negative things.
I never would have been able to shed the dyslexic label unless I went through the trauma that I went through.
Right. I think that's a very important message for people to see because, or to
Mm-hmm.
hear, because maybe they aren't going through dyslexia. They're going through something else.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the attitude that you have towards it can be implemented to all of it.
Right. Yes. And there's actually a little bit more to my story, you know, with that low self-esteem, just to kind of catch up a little bit. I didn't believe I deserved that good husband that my parents were supposed to find for me.
Okay.
And I ended up marrying to a narcissist.
Ah.
And I was there for 6 years. And I actually had to plan and execute my escape.
Mm.
And it was after that that I realized how traumatized I was. I was driving through red lights and stop signs. And I knew I needed help. And I
Yeah.
said no.
So that part's interesting there too, where it
Mm-hmm.
sounded like on one hand, you were able to overcome some obstacles and had a good belief in yourself in one hand.
Right.
But on the other hand, you didn't feel like you deserved like a
Exactly.
good husband. Where do you think that disconnect came from?
Well, the psychological term is actually called maladaptive attributes.
Oh, there
And I
you go.
actually write about that in my book. And it's the idea that the good things or the accomplishments don't really come from inside of me. I just somehow was able to manifest them. I was somehow able to graduate from college. I was somehow able to get my master's degree. But I could never fully give myself credit in my
Okay.
heart. I still had that dyslexic tattoo. You're broken, you're labeled. And the other, and that felt very permanent to me. And what I don't think a lot of people realize is when you do that to a child, it becomes part of their identity. And in order to shed that identity, I had to totally reach my surrender point. And it was after escaping from my ex and just saying, I need help, I surrender. And that, I want to be clear, surrendering is not a failure. Surrendering is the point of just realizing you need some help.
I mean, surrender is the big concept in like AA and NA,
Exactly.
and they'll say surrender to win.
Right.
Where, and
Right.
that's and it's surrender in the positive sense. Now,
Exactly.
and I guess for you, you couldn't give yourself credit for the things you were accomplishing. But
Right.
I guess so it was like kind of like a magical thinking. You thought it was like
Yes.
outside of you or like
Mhm.
a higher power or something or
Yep. Can I ask you a favor? Can we
Sure.
pause just for a second?
Sure.
Oh, I'll be.
Okay. Yep. Sometimes this kind of stuff happens when you're live here. But the two things I wanted to like she made me think of before. The parent's voice. Oh, now she's back.
I'm back.
I was
Sorry.
going to go on a little tangent, but you were too quick.
Sorry.
But what was I saying? Oh yeah, so you couldn't give yourself credit
Right.
for the things you were doing well. And was
Right.
that part of like a magical thinking thing or what was that about?
As far as I understand it, it is a real psychological wound.
Okay.
Um, it comes from the concept of learned helplessness. It's kind of all put together into a bundle, if you will. Um, I'm just not that much of an expert on it. I just kind of know my piece of it with the maladaptive attributes.
I
So,
got you. And perhaps you could also share about how you escaped the narcissistic husband of yours.
sure. So, I was really focused on making my marriage work. And I didn't understand what was really happening to me. And I wrote in my book, really in great detail, about a lot of the experiences of just our interactions. And I was being manipulated, I was being gaslighted, and I was being controlled and put down. And I didn't even realize it was happening. It was so subtle.
Uh,
And it's so methodical and so subtle, and it's over a period of time. And it is like it's a slow motion kind of emotional abuse. I'm trying to think, that's probably the best way I can describe it. And I just kept trying to make the marriage work, make the interactions work. I was focusing on all of that, not realizing that to him it was a game.
Hmm.
And I was a chew toy. I was a psychological chew toy.
Right.
Yeah,
Now, I think that's a very common experience
it
amongst a
is.
lot of people in general.
Mhm.
When they're with a narcissistic person, they want the relationship to work. They want
Right.
to make it work somehow, some way. So, do
Right.
you remember what your mindset was at that point? Like, what would you think to yourself? Oh, if this fails, this means this. Or do you know what your thinking was? Do you
Um,
remember?
I was just so focused on making the marriage work that I was actually giving up everything that made me me.
Okay.
And I didn't realize it was happening. And I just knew I didn't want to be a divorced woman.
Oh, that's what I mean. That's
Yeah.
the root there. You didn't want to be a divorced woman. Okay.
No, nobody wants to be a divorced person. And I will say that this is not just women; it is men. It
Sure.
happens to men too. Um, but I really didn't understand what was happening until I just got to the point where I realized there was no hope, there was no marriage, and I actually had it was a very clear moment to me. So I want to back up and I just share about a relationship I had in college. And this is all in my book. So I had a very healthy, wonderful relationship with a Marine Corps officer. And he actually was in the process of becoming an officer when we were in college together. And he and I loved each other very much. And I always knew it because I could see it in his face. I could see it in his face and I could see it in his eyes every time he looked at me. And that's wonderful. And that's what it's supposed to be like. And I went looking for that in my marriage. And I remembered that look. And I went and I looked at the man I was married to, and all I saw was cold black eyes looking back at me.
Hmm.
And that's when I realized there was nothing to save. It was time to get out.
What happened with the Marine?
The stress of a military relationship
Okay.
and deployments, and it just didn't work out. And that's okay. I'm grateful that he was a part of my life when he was a part of my life. Um, but yeah, time goes on, life goes on.
Fine.
So
And it sounds like your husband, he might have been more on the covert side,
yes,
being that the abuse was more subtle. I know
very.
for people that takes a long time for
Mhm.
people to really see. It can take decades in some cases for people to notice it. The same thing if someone has a narcissistic parent, it can take the kid into his 30s before he realizes what he actually or she actually went through.
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. That's a great description. And he was also had this personality who was kind of like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So in public, he was Mr. Popular. He took his dad to church. He did all those things to look good on the outside, but the real man on the inside was very, very different. And behind
Ah,
closed doors, he was very different. And that's very common from what I've read and watched. So
absolutely. That is a very common occurrence where the community and the people around will think
mhm.
it's the best person in the world, so helpful, so great, etc., which really gives the gaslighting effect to the people who are actually living with that person
Right.
because they see the other side, right? They
Yes.
see the put downs, the
Mhm.
gaslighting, the controlling, the abuse. The rest of the world doesn't see it. So it
Right.
makes that people with them at home makes them feel more alone.
It does. It's very, very isolating. And and it's exactly what you said. It's very confusing. Because on one hand, you've got this public figure or public persona, and then behind closed doors is completely different. And you're sitting there scratching your head going, what on earth and what did I do? Or, of course, is there something I can fix? And it has nothing to do with that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So dealing with that whole circumstance, did that peel back another layer of the onion there where you leave him, you break a trauma bond more than likely,
Yeah.
and that really kind of puts you on a good trajectory after that?
Yes, that was the big turning point for me. That was when I got to work with therapists and coaches and eventually finding my way to Learn to Thrive and to Mark Devine's program.
There you go. And that's a common thing for a lot of people too. They have a relationship with a narcissistic person or some other manipulator or abuser, and it gives them the gift of
Mhm.
learning how to grow, or the opportunity to grow, and the opportunity to work on themselves.
Yeah. And the person I was before and the person I am now, I am just astonished. I had no idea what I was capable of. I had no idea of the healing I could do, and I had no idea of my own potential, and I'm still uncovering my potential.
It'll never end. Just like the growth, right? There's always going to be more
Yes.
to learn,
Hmm.
and you just don't know. You don't know what you don't know. And
Right.
it's always interesting to me, like as years go by, you look back and you think, oh yeah, I really was silly at this point. I really was ridiculous at this point. And then I think right now I'm 38. It's like, when I'm 48, I'm sure I'll think to myself, man, my 38-year-old self was pretty dumb in some ways, right? Something like that. I don't know what those ways are.
Right.
My future self is embarrassed to see what those ways are, but I'm sure there are some.
Right. And your future self is probably saying it's okay because this is your journey and
Right.
this is the pathway that you have to take to get there.
Right. You
So,
can't shortcut it. You can't shortcut it, unfortunately.
right.
So
Right.
it's just you got to deal with what you got to deal with.
Right.
So what's been the biggest shift for you? So from now, you have a good mindset now. We'll get
Yeah.
into the Mark Divine part in a second here. But what is the difference in your thinking now? What do you think is the biggest shift compared to how it was?
Yeah. So the biggest shift was the first coach that I worked with, who was a general life coach. And he helped me just destroy the power of the label of being dyslexic.
Okay.
He and I, if you look at it from the hero's journey context, he and I slayed that dragon together.
Okay.
And
So
he
that
was,
was like an anchor for you.
yes, very much so. He was a wonderful, wonderful coach. And that was the belief system and the identity that was imposed on me, that I was broken and brain damaged, just didn't just traumatize me, it lowered my self-esteem and self-worth. And that label had to go in order for me to begin to move forward.
Oh, that makes sense completely.
Yeah.
So even then, with all of that, so you went to that coach and he gave you some of those breakthroughs. What kind of breakthroughs did you get from going to therapy, or what other kind of treatment that you got?
Sure. So a lot of the work I did was around the EMDR work, which is
Okay.
specifically, as you know, specifically for trauma. And that was the trauma of being in an abusive relationship for 6 years.
Right.
So we did a lot of work around that. Um, I know so many people are so afraid to do this work, and I want people to know that it is freeing. It may be a little scary, but it's a lot more scary to hold on to that stuff for the rest of your life.
Right.
And when things like EMDR, and that worked very well for me. Everybody's going to be different. They're going to respond differently to different treatments. But to me, it was a total game changer. And I did 4 years of intense therapy, going over and reviewing childhood trauma, from the bullying to different events throughout life, as well as, the marriage and how bad that was. It was 6 years of abuse. So
Right.
it took a long time to work through it.
So how does EMDR work? Because I know it's something with rapid eye movements. How do they actually do it? Because I've never done it myself.
Yeah, there's different kinds of EMDR, and I'm not an expert, but my experience is that it is one of the components is rapid eye movement. But the gist of it, what happens is it's rewiring the brain and wiring in a new perspective or a new
Okay.
story.
Okay.
So that trauma loop of the event is actually broken. To all the professionals out there listening, I apologize if I don't have that right.
So it sounds similar to like a CBT, similar to DBT, even where I think they might just try to accomplish the same goal, but in a different way. I think.
Yes, and there's different kinds of EMDR. There is there are devices that you could hold that vibrate at a certain pulse while you're actually kind of revisualizing an event. And then there's also, you can follow a therapist's finger or a pencil or something like that. And then there's also lights that can be utilized that go back and forth that you can follow.
Okay.
I know that there's a connection with REM sleep and the rapid eye movement that happens when we all experience REM sleep. And that's kind of the origin of EMDR. But again, I'm not an expert. I don't know exactly how it works.
I got you. So does someone have to have a special certification in EMDR? Do most clinical therapists just know how to do it anyway? Or how does that part work?
The therapists that I have worked with have had a specific certification.
Okay.
And I have gone looking for, when I've signed up to work with somebody, I look for somebody who has that certification. And it is a specialized training, but it's within being a licensed therapist or counselor or whatever your credential is.
Okay. So it's kind of like a postmaster's type certificate where
Or
you need a master's or doctorate and then you can get the EMDR certification or something like that.
I believe that that's the case. So it's like a subset or a sub training.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's important to know too for anyone who wants to try it out there to
Yes.
know the right kinds of people to look for because people
Yes.
might
Yeah.
get led astray and we don't want that.
You know, one of the things I talk about all the time is with the coaches I have worked with and the therapists. You know, it's like real estate, location, location, location. With anybody who you work with, credentials, credentials, credentials. Because it's like you said, there are people out there who are more than happy to take your money
Sure.
and not help
Sure.
you and maybe even injure you.
Sure.
So
There are certainly people like that out there for sure. I think my philosophy with that part is I think credentials are good, although just because someone has credentials doesn't mean they know what they're talking about.
exactly.
And vice versa, right? So I would say be careful of people that make like fantastical claims or
Yes.
wild claims. Oh, miracle cure this or something like that.
Right.
That's the kind of stuff to watch out for. And I think like there are coaches out there who do good, but then I think there's also coaches out there who are probably grifters and are taking advantage of people. I think it really just all depends. It depends on the person.
I agree with you 100%.
So after your narcissistic relationship there, what was it like starting to date again? What were the challenges you had to go through?
You know, for a long time I didn't want to date.
That's a common thing too.
Yeah. I think the biggest thing was learning to trust, not just other people. And this also applies to friendships, not just dating, but also learning to trust myself.
Right.
To know that I could discern and spot the narcissist.
Sure. I think that's the biggest part, honestly, trusting yourself, because when you trust yourself and you understand about narcissism, you understand about manipulation, you'll trust yourself to act accordingly. If you start to see those red flags, etc.
Right.
So generally, when I hear people saying they got trust issues, I always think to myself, what you really mean is you're not trusting yourself to act accordingly in case X, Y, or Z happens.
Right.
So that's a big part of it.
And I think the other thing that I experienced too is that there's a whole new level of expectations. And if somebody's a jerk, I'm just not giving you the second or third chance. It's not happening. And that's not just for dating, it's also for friendships. If somebody's inappropriate and or just is out of line, I'm just not going to put up with it. I'm not going to have that in my life anymore. So,
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that.
yeah.
Nothing wrong with that at all. You got to protect your energy, as I would say.
Yes.
You protect your energy and protect your space.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So at this point, was it post the narcissistic relationship that you discovered Mark Divine's work?
Yes. So 2016, I went to my first in-person event with him.
What was that event called?
It was called the Unbeatable Mind Experience at the time. I think they've changed the name slightly, but I was blown away by that event. And at that event, I actually got to do surf torture.
Well, could you share about this event and what surf torture is? Because I think I know what surf torture is, but I'd like to hear you explain it.
So part of BUDS, or Basic Underwater Demolition, which is SEAL's selection process, is they do a thing called surf torture. And they go out in the cold ocean and they link arms and they put their back to the ocean and the waves are crashing over their head and they have to get up, they have to sit down, but the whole time the waves are hitting them and crashing over them, and sometimes they're laying flat in the ocean. They have to hold on to each other. They can't let go. So the idea is to be part of a boat crew and not let go. Okay. And I had an absolute blast. I was like a 6-year-old kid again.
I know, I think about 10 years ago, I think is when I discovered Mark Divine, and he had that Unbeatable Mind book. Mm-hmm. And one of the biggest takeaways I had from it was that he was saying all of these like really hard workouts were 80% mental, 20% physical.
Yes.
And when you take that part of the mindset and apply it to all areas of life, I think it's true. Like,
I agree.
You do that, you'll be rocking and rolling in all areas. But what else did you learn at this event? I'd be very curious to hear.
I think the other thing that is so important is the breath work. And it is so unbelievably simple and yet so powerful. He uses a program called box breathing. I don't know if you remember reading about that. And it's a box breathing simply is a inhale for a period of time, a hold, and then an exhale for the same period of time, and then hold. So you're kind of going in a box. But the idea is to be consistent. And that time when you're doing the hold, it quiets the mind. One of the things that's very interesting about Mark is he's a great student of the Eastern philosophies. And he's certified in, I believe, at least seven different yoga philosophies. So here you have a retired Navy SEAL with 20 years experience, and he's combining that training with Eastern philosophy, yoga, and breathwork. And it is incredibly powerful.
No, I can imagine. I mean, that's a good combination there. A very dynamic combination too.
Yes. And like we talked about before, the onion, his training also has layers. And that's one of the reasons I have been around for so long is the first event I went to, I got so much from it. I said, okay, I'm coming back next year. And I found new layers and my life just kept getting better. So I just kept going back. I was really learning to thrive and enjoy life again. And I was reinventing myself and really just enjoying everything and loving life again.
I know a lot of people probably think he's like a Tony Robbins or something like that. But I'd say he goes usually in more depth, I would think, than Tony Robbins does. Now, because Tony Robbins will also do some of these like seminars and weekend getaways, unleash the power within. Similar. Right. It's similar stuff, except I think Tony Robbins is more expensive, is what I think. Than Mark
Probably.
Divine.
I know his events are much bigger. And actually, Mark has spoken at some of Tony's events.
I believe it because I mean Tony Robbins, he knows the kinds of people that have a similar mindset and are on a similar wavelength.
Exactly.
So that part's good.
When I was growing up, my dad was always encouraging me to do all these different things. He'd say to me, you can do whatever you want to do, but get properly trained, because that's when you mitigate risk. You want to learn to scuba dive, get certified, learn all the safety pieces of it, do it right. And he also would say to me, whenever possible, learn from the best.
Sound advice.
Yeah. And that was one of the reasons why I ended up at an Unbeatable Mind program, because I think we can all agree the Navy SEALs are the best in the world at what they do.
Yeah, they've had a resurgence amongst the business world too. So
Yes.
people like Jocko Willink, the guy who did the University of Texas commencement speech. Do you know that guy? He was the guy who talked about the power of making your bed. Admiral McCraven.
Admiral McCraven.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So those three are some pretty popular Navy SEALs right now. And there's more. There's more.
Yes.
The American Sniper was one.
Yeah.
And then something Cottrell, I think.
Yes, Marcus Luttrell. Yeah.
That's another one. So there's 5 right there.
Yeah.
So they're getting the notoriety that they probably deserve.
Well, everybody wants to go to Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and that's great, and that all has its place. But I want to learn from the best.
Right. Well, because they have practical experience under the most stressful environments.
Exactly.
Like that's what someone who goes to Harvard or Yale, they might have a expertise in one small area of things, right? And whatever stress comes with that. But you can't be or even come close to having to go through combat, buds training, and that kind of thing. It's just, there's no comparison.
Right. What drove me there was I wanted to understand how they did it. I wanted to understand how they got through buds. How do they get through Hell Week? 5 days and no sleep, relentless physical training. How does any human being do that? And that's what I wanted to learn about. That was why I went.
And you learned that mindset is the answer?
Mindset is the answer.
Breathing. The other thing is other breathing technique I remember him talking about was, I think maybe it was in the middle of reps or when you're running, to count. He would always say to count in the middle of your reps. So like, it's kind of like a little bit of self-hypnosis, maybe even NLP like, but he would say, when you're running, you count like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you repeat. And something about that hypnotic effect, you kind of forget a little bit about the physical pain you might be in.
Exactly. Yeah.
So they have a lot of those great little mindset tools. And I would recommend his work to anyone, regardless of what they're dealing with or what they're going through. Because the lessons of the mindset lessons, they apply to all areas of life.
Right.
It's not just one area here. It's not just dyslexia. It's not just narcissism.
Right.
Any area you can think of.
Right.
Attitude and mindset will be a major part of it. And
Absolutely.
like when I do coaching with people, for example, right after mental health and addiction, because I try to help people with those things first, because if those things are off the rocker, they got to take care of those things first.
Yeah,
right?
that's the foundation.
Right. But then once that's like at least in the right direction, then it's mindset. And mindset will certainly contribute to the addiction and mental health part too. They all intertwine. But what I've noticed was people who didn't want to do like my mindset work, whether it was self-hypnosis or writing affirmations, etc., we would go on with the program, and the mindset issues and a lack of belief in themselves is what would come up later. Like, oh, why didn't you do this? We set up this goal together. Why didn't you do it?
Right.
And when push came to shove, it would be, well, I didn't believe I could, or I couldn't. I don't have the belief in myself to do it. Now I say, see, this is why you got to get that part down. Like, it's no joke. Like, people don't take it seriously.
Right.
Like, oh, it's just silly mindset, silly after. But when people start to see the power of it, then all of a sudden it doesn't seem so silly anymore.
Right.
And you know what really helped me with it too? I know Scott Adams. Do you know him?
I know that name. I'm not placing it though.
He was the guy who created the Dilbert comic strip.
Oh, okay.
He was on Tim Ferriss's show.
Okay.
And he was talking about his story with mindset and hypnosis. And what happened was he said he met a hypnotist that said, whatever you want, Mr. Dilbert, you write it down 15 times every morning. So he
Okay.
started doing that by practicing. He was taking this like master's degree test, maybe it's the GREs, and he wrote, I'm going to get a 93 on my GREs.
Okay.
And he wrote that down 15 times a day for however long. And wouldn't you know, that's exactly the score he got. Now, he said he
That's
didn't
good.
say it was because he did it, but he
Right.
said just coincidentally, that is so happened to the score he got. And then he used it for some nefarious purposes too. He wanted to get with some woman in his office place, and so he wrote that down 15 times, and that worked for him too. And he said it was before he was wealthy, so he couldn't attribute it to that either.
Right.
So,
Right.
but he had like 3 examples of that, and I was like, you know what? I'm going to try that out. So literally for years, I've been writing things down 15 times a day about all sorts of things. So it's like my mindset program. And this is the science behind it too, for the people who think this is all woo-woo and
Right.
ridiculous and there's no science behind it. They're learning more and more about the plasticity in people's brains. So
Yes. Yes.
neuroplasticity means,
Neuroplasticity. Yeah.
yeah, your brain can change
Mm-hmm.
over time and you can create new grooves and new neural pathways.
Yes.
And when you do that, the opportunities and the ceilings of your potential, I believe, can certainly get higher. So
Mm-hmm.
when you do that, you can certainly change your brain. And
Yeah.
when you change your brain and you change the way you think, you can
Mm-hmm.
change your outcomes.
Change your
Bottom
life.
line.
Mm-hmm.
So I recommend it to everybody. Most people probably, and this is the other thing, they say when the student is ready, the teacher will arrive. Now, I used to try to say all this stuff to people I would meet. Like I would be a
Right.
bouncer at a bar, and I remember talking to the girls there about like this mindset stuff and investing stuff, and they would just fall on deaf ears because they didn't care.
Right.
So like I'm like, okay, you gotta really only tell it to people that are interested,
Mm-hmm.
that are interested in learning it because they're ready. But
Right.
like I would be so overcome with like the happiness and the knowledge of learning this new thing. I wanted to share it with everybody,
I'm right
but
there with you.
no one cared. People didn't care. So I learned you gotta save it for who really wants it.
Right. Right. And it's so funny because the chapter that I wrote about, the first chapter I wrote about working and attending Mark's event, that's exactly how I start the chapter.
There you go. See?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's funny how people who start to become successful, they
Mm-hmm.
usually share some similar qualities in their stories. There's
Yep.
similar stuff going on. And I don't think that's a coincidence either.
Right. 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 And one of the points I want to make too is, Mark's program naturally attracts a larger amount of men than women. And I'd really like to encourage any women who see this or are watching, it's not just for men. It is a bunch of Navy SEALs and martial arts experts, and they're incredible coaches and have incredible expertise. Um, but me going as a woman ended up being very, very important. It ended up taking me down a road of self-defense training.
Aha. What did you do?
So, one of the events that Mark does is called sheepdog training. And that's a 3-day event. And that has emergency medical training, martial arts and self-defense training, and then also some firearms training.
Okay.
And I did that, and that was a wake-up call. And again, going back to what you were saying, it's about mindset. I didn't have the self-defense mindset. And I figured that out in the middle of that training. And it completely shifted me. I've also done a couple days of training with a retired FBI agent. His name is Dennis Stoika. He's also a coach. He's in the East Coast. And it's a shift in your mindset to be, situationally aware. And, I haven't heard from my ex-husband, and I really don't want to. But now that I've written this book, I have to be aware that that's a possibility.
Sure. Sure.
So knowing how to defend myself is very important, but it's also about how I think about it. I'm so aware, and I actually think I avoided a situation a couple months ago. I was in Arvada, Colorado, with a good friend of mine. We get together, we go out for coffee, and we have a very big homeless population here in the Denver area, which is very unfortunate. And this very tall, very powerful man was walking right towards me, and he was looking me in the eye, and he was sizing me up. And I looked him back in the eye, and without even a conscious thought, I just went right to that place of do not mess with me, and looked him right in the eye, and he kept going.
I've heard things like that before too, where they were interviewing predators in jail,
Mm-hmm.
and they said they could detect the person that would be the victim
Mm-hmm.
just by how they walked.
Mm-hmm.
So there were people that were giving, and it didn't matter if it was an old woman
Mm-hmm.
or like a teenage dude. There was something in the way people were walking and in
Yeah.
the way they were sub-communicating something about themselves that's what the predator types were picking up on.
Yes.
But when people had that, what you just said, they
Yep.
were the ones they didn't mess with
Yep.
because, and this hurts people's feelings too, but the predator types, usually they want like an easy kill a lot of times, for lack
They
of a
don't want
better
the
word.
difficult fight.
Right. Usually not.
Usually, yeah.
It might be a bigger score for them if they hit a difficult one, but for
Right.
the most part, they want to get like the easy hit
Mm-hmm.
and get it out and run, right? Because they
Yep.
don't want too much of a struggle on their hands.
Right.
But that's like encouraging, because if that's how it is,
Right.
you can do what you did.
Exactly.
And I think right now, women are more likely than they ever were to go to do something like Mark Levine's program,
Mm-hmm.
do self-defense training, martial arts training.
Yeah.
Now, the martial arts training, was that like a jiu-jitsu, like a Muay Thai, karate, or?
In this case, it was Wing Chun.
Okay, I know it.
Yeah. And the instructor that we had trained under one of Bruce Lee's students.
Bruce Lee, he's a good man.
Yeah. So, but what I learned was not just the Wing Chun moves, but I had this incredible moment where I realized I had been the prey. And I had no idea I was acting like prey.
Well, that's a good question to ask you. How do you think you were acting like prey?
I was low self-esteem. I'm sure I had that that reflected in my body, in my motion, and how I moved. And I am absolutely certain that was why my ex-husband targeted me.
Now, that's something that would be controversial, I know, for people to even hear or think about, because, and again, because people have a hard time with more than one thing being true at once. Like,
Sure.
just because you had low self-esteem and you were victimized doesn't mean what happened to you was like your fault. It's like you didn't know what you didn't know at the time.
No.
And that's what people conflate with
Okay.
this whole kind of speaking. And I've heard people say things like, the predator or the narcissist, they will only pick like a high value person to victimize. And I thought to myself, I think that might make people feel good, but I don't know if it's necessarily true.
Yeah.
Like, it's just one of those things, people will say it because it feels good to say, but
Sure.
I don't know how accurate it actually is.
Right. And in my statements, I'm basing on my personal experience.
Right.
I look back now and I am crystal clear. I was low self-esteem and I was putting up with bad behavior from everybody around me and trying to solve their problems. And it's not my job to solve your problem or make you happy.
That's the codependent thing. The codependent thing is to solve, but there's two layers to it, right?
Right.
So a codependent person, they feel more comfortable solving other people's problems.
Right.
And dealing with their stuff. But the second layer to it is they're doing that to meet their own needs too. Like, that's how the codependent meets their needs, by helping the other person meet theirs. So it's not necessarily like, just a completely selfless thing. It's like, no, that's how the codependent will meet their own needs. That's what they'll do to feel like loved or special or important.
And I agree with you 100%. And if they're so focused on somebody else, they don't have to look at their own stuff.
Exactly. Right. So they meet their needs by helping someone else, but
Mm-hmm.
there's probably all sorts of things they should be doing in their own lives to truly help themselves. Right. They might be temporarily getting some needs met, but not the goals and the needs they should be striving for.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's a whole different thing.
That's a whole other conversation.
And I've been there myself where I would get hooked on solving other people's stuff or hooked on one individual girl at a time.
Mm-hmm.
And they were really just distractions. It was just like a major distraction to prevent me from doing what I was really supposed to be doing. And I mean, ultimately it was part of the journey, but at the same point, I should have been doing other things. My mindset was way off base, where like I was just caught up on things that were not my thing to be caught up on. It was like almost a mental masturbation to a point where it's like I'm helping this other person here, but it was all just an avoidant technique. Right. An avoidant technique to avoid working on my own stuff.
Right. Right. We are very good at distracting ourselves.
Sure. Sure. And that's what the others say too. When your body or when you really are tricking yourself, you'll do something hard, but it will be the thing that isn't the main thing you're supposed to do. So you'll trick yourself into thinking, oh, I'm doing some hard work here, but it's really to avoid the real hard work that you don't want to do.
Yes.
And so that can happen sometimes too, which is just something to pay attention to.
And be mindful of, sure.
But like you said, though, this is all layers. Like there is going to be layers to this. And that's like when I guess that's how you found me from Facebook. But it's like there's so many different layers and places where people can be. So that like when someone's at the beginning and their awareness of narcissism and things is pretty low, like how I talk to them or how you talk to them, it's just going to have to be at a different level because they're going to be probably upset. Like some of the things that we talked about here today,
right?
They'd be upset hearing it because they're not really in the place to hear it. Right. It might seem like gaslighting to them or invalidating to them. But it's like one of those stage 2 or stage 3 or phase 2 or phase 3 concepts where once you get to it, then it makes sense. Like, oh yeah, now that's where I am. Yeah, okay, it makes sense. But when you're in the beginning, they can't even, it would mess them up to even hear some of these advanced concepts.
Right. Yeah. And the other thing too is that somebody who is just coming out of or just gotten away from a narcissistic relationship, they're probably dealing with some trauma.
Absolutely.
And thinking and problem solving, and this was my experience, just functioning and thinking and problem solving for me for a period of time was temporarily gone. Like I said, I was driving through stop signs and red lights. That was from trauma.
Scary.
It was frightening, but it woke me up.
How often did that happen?
Oh, it maybe happened 4 or 5 times.
So it's kind of like a disassociation?
Yeah.
I could see that. I mean, I know that's what they say borderlines will do. Like, so borderlines, they will dissociate a lot. And a lot of it, they dissociate because of some childhood abuse or some form of childhood trauma, often sexual, that, it's just too painful for them to like tackle. But perhaps that's exactly a good use case for EMDR.
Exactly.
To try to tackle that so that kind of thing doesn't happen. Here's a good question for you. Sure. Do you know if EMDR has any impact on, say, personality disorders?
I don't know. Or I should say, I don't believe so. I believe its focus is on trauma.
Okay. So I guess what they would say is, they would say like narcissism and borderline are trauma-based disorders.
That's my understanding.
And if something's a trauma-based disorder,
right?
Maybe there could be. I think my impression of borderline and narcissism is with narcissism, they'll say a cure isn't possible, but behavior modification is. Now, with borderline, I think people do say it might be curable, I
Mhm.
think.
Right.
And not to mention there'll be some behavior modifications too. But there are some people who do really seem to improve. And I don't know if cured is the right word or not. Maybe it's just they've really learned how to work with it and they've learned how to not act out.
Right.
I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah. That's a good question. I think everything you said is reasonable and it sounds like things that I've heard before too. So I think you're right on the right track.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a clinical psychologist myself, so
Hmm.
everyone has to take what I say with a grain of salt in that regard. But I
Sure.
do like to try to be informed with what I say. I don't like to
Of
lead
course.
people astray in any
Of
way.
course. Of
So
course. Yeah.
I try to be mindful and careful of what I'm throwing out there.
And I do as well. So I appreciate that.
Of course, I mean it's important. It's
Yeah.
once you do something like write a book like you
Yeah.
have with great power comes great responsibility. So
Yes.
that you gotta be mindful of, you're not going to be able to control how everyone interprets like what
Hmm.
you say,
Yep.
but you can try your best so that when you look back at it, you'll say, I get how people could misinterpret this, but I didn't do anything that was like really blatantly off the mark
Right.
kind of thing. Right. And
Right.
I think there's a difference, right? Because some
There is.
people will find a way to be upset
Yes.
with
There you go.
anything, right? They'll look at the one exception to the meme and say, can you believe this? Can you believe that? And I was like, of course. There's
Of course.
always going to be something you could say or find a way to be upset about or offended about. But
Right. Right.
like that's usually not like if that wasn't your intent, I think you're pretty good. Right.
Right.
And it's like the expression they'll say also, a gentleman is somebody who is never rude unintentionally. And I was like, yeah, okay, I can get with that.
I like that. That
Yeah,
works really well.
I believe so.
Yeah. And what you just explained was just such a very important part of my editing process and rewrites and footnotes. And it took that long because I was intent on getting it right and making it professional. And I know that there's going to be somebody out there who's going to tear apart pieces of
Um,
it, and that's fine. And
I'm sure.
have
I'm
at it.
sure.
But I know what I put out there was my best work. And it was done professionally and edited by professional editors. And that was very, very important to me.
Good.
Yeah.
What did you learn from the whole process of writing a book?
Oh my gosh. It was incredibly cathartic, incredibly healing. I found my bravery. I don't know if you realize who my publisher is.
I saw you had a video of her on your
Yeah,
Facebook page. Her name is Jen, I think it was.
Jessica Buchanan.
Jess. I knew it started with a J. Okay.
Yeah, you're close. So Jess is actually quite well known, and she's a New York Times bestselling author. She was a teacher in Somalia, and she was actually kidnapped and held by Somali pirates for 93 days. And this was back in 2012. And President Obama sent in SEAL Team 6, and they rescued her.
Oh, that was a big story.
It was a really big
And
story.
so she became a publisher after that.
Yes. So one of the things that she's really focused on is raising up women's voices and women who have had, really big challenges. So she started a small little, she's a startup, I guess you could say.
Yeah.
But that's how I ended up working with her. And she's a wonderful woman. She's wonderful to work with. And her story is just mind blowing. So, and most Americans have heard her name because they heard her story. It was national news.
And it's Jessica what again for people who want to check it out?
Sure. It's Jessica Buchanan.
Jessica Buchanan. Okay.
And she wrote Impossible Odds.
I think I've heard of that book.
Yeah, it was a New York Times bestseller. So, yeah.
And here she is. She's going to be amplifying your voice too.
Yeah. So she's great to work with.
She's a good person to do it.
Yes. Yeah, that's one of the reasons I chose her.
Yeah. I mean, she seems like she'd be an interesting person to talk to as well, especially with that story she has.
Yes.
Can only imagine what that does to you and what that does to your perspective.
I, I've heard her say often that she had to learn to survive the surviving.
That's an interesting way to put it.
Yeah.
So when she says it like that, do you think she means like just what she have to do to get through being the prisoner, or get through like the recovery process on the other side, like when you're free?
I think she means the recovery process. That's
Okay.
my interpretation. So,
Interesting.
yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So with you though, you learned, that's what you basically learned from writing the book. Is there anything you would do differently, you think? Like now that you've been through the process here?
As far as writing and telling the story,
Just anything.
no, I'm really happy with it. I wish I could have made it a faster process.
Okay. That makes sense. That makes
It,
sense.
it just takes the time it takes. But I'm very happy with it, how it came out. So it was what I wanted to put out there. I definitely moved through a lot of fear. Just kept asking myself, do I really want to put this story out there that is so personal? I mean, I share some very private moments, some very intimate moments, and also the death of my parents. And those are, yes, they are intimate moments. It's not necessarily how we would normally use that word, or very private moments. But they were very, very powerful, and that's why I wanted to share them.
I'm sure. I mean, death, that's a very powerful thing.
It is.
And people, it's kind of one of those things, we've been talking about layers a lot. I think there's a lot of layers to the grief process too, where it's like maybe a shock, and then you kind of slowly, truly realize, yeah, they're not here anymore, and they're not coming back, and you can't ever talk to them again. So there's a lot of layers in that process.
Right. But one of the things I have learned recently is that they are very much still with us, and they're very much still within me, because I have their DNA. So
yeah.
That's been a wonderful revelation for me. But also, it was a very cathartic process to write this book. And it was really the victory of beating the dyslexic label, because I knew that I had absolutely won the war for my self-esteem and self-worth.
Very good. Who do you think is the target audience for your book, or who do you think would benefit from reading your book?
I think anybody who has a learning disability like dyslexia, or has a child that is, been labeled or diagnosed, to just really be able to understand maybe what that person is experiencing, or that child is experiencing. And then, of course, women or men, anybody who's in a narcissistic relationship or in an abusive relationship.
Well, there's plenty of them here.
Yeah.
That are following me. How about people who have had ADHD, or maybe people who are on the spectrum? Do you think they would benefit as well?
I think anytime that you're not in the middle, anytime you're an outlier, I think anybody who's in that outlier category would benefit from it. Though I don't speak to those things directly, I think you can make a connection pretty easily, and just just by knowing how it feels to be separated or taken away, and given, having your identity changed, and ideas just imposed on you.
Yeah, I really don't like that idea of ideas being imposed on you.
Mm-hmm.
It is like a spell, for lack of a better word, like a condemnation.
It is, and that's exactly what happened to me. I was condemned.
Yeah, not good.
Yeah.
Now, and I know ADHD, that is making a comeback right now, or maybe not a comeback, but people are talking about it as in they're dealing with it and how they're trying to overcome it and deal with it. I think that's important. Same thing with people on the spectrum as well. That's a big thing right now. Yeah. More people are owning that than ever. And I think that's good too. And with the dyslexia, like I said, I don't hear too many people talking about it. I hear people talking about it, like I mentioned in the beginning, as
Right.
more of a throwaway line a lot of times,
Hmm.
but I don't know how serious they're being. And maybe they are serious, and shame on me for not believing them if they are serious. But like it's something some people will just say, "Oh, I'm just dyslexic," something like that. I don't know if they're
Yeah.
being real about it or not.
Well, it's funny because, when I tell my story, people are like, "Oh, yeah, I'm dyslexic too." And I'm like, okay, have you ever been tested? Just
Right.
because you reverse a few letters doesn't make you dyslexic.
Right.
With me, there was a formal diagnosis process that I went through as a very young child and then was continuously tested all the way through high school graduation. So, but to your point, yeah, I think a lot of people don't understand the term and understand what it really means. And I think a lot of people don't really understand or know what some of the gifts are that come with being
Sure.
dyslexic.
Sure.
Um, did you know that the British intelligence services are specifically recruiting people who are dyslexic?
I did not know that.
Yeah. We have a very unique ability to see gist, connections, and patterns that most people miss.
So that's why they'll do it. They want people to become like maybe part of some sort of special ops or government workers to
I
notice patterns and things.
It could be that. My thought process was more of like an analyst kind of thing,
Okay.
where they can see like terrorist cells who are connected and how they're related, and maybe they're related by bloodline or those types of things. But I never thought of it in the context that you just mentioned. But yeah, that would work too. And then because we're such great visual thinkers, it's like we're born with CAD software. So we can take this pen and we can rotate it, this all in our mind, and we can take it apart and put it together and change the color. Now, if you're a scientist, that's a really big skill. So NASA actually actively recruits people who are dyslexic.
I did not know that either.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
Now, do you think dyslexia can translate to chess playing, maybe, or poker playing?
I would think the chess would probably be the better one because you
Okay.
can probably because you can see the board, whereas with the other ones you'd probably be card counting.
Right. Okay.
With poker, but that's just a guess.
No, I think you're right about that because I think with the chessboard, it is more of like a game of things you see.
Right, it's right
Poker is more of the game of what you don't see. You don't know. You have partial information.
there. Yeah.
With chess, you have all information
Hmm.
besides what's in their head.
Right,
Right.
right, right.
But the actual things in play, you know all the information in play. With poker, you only know what the community cards are and your cards are. You don't know what their cards are.
Right,
So I guess
right.
that's where the disconnect would be with that. Now, but though, 3 rapid fire questions though
Sure,
before we wrap it up here.
sure.
So number 1, someone who has a dyslexia now, and maybe they're struggling, maybe they're not. What would be your suggestions to them? What would you say to them if that is where they find themselves?
The first thing I'd tell them to do is go get the book called The Dyslexic Advantage
Sounds like a good one.
because it completely changed my life. It focuses on what dyslexic abilities are, not disabilities.
Very good. I like that.
So, and it's two MDs, husband and wife team, who in a very scientifically credentialed way have laid out some incredible information about dyslexic abilities and the talents that you naturally have.
And I wonder if they have any other of that series, like the ADHD advantage or the spectrum advantage or
Yeah,
the borderline advantage. Could be an interesting series.
yeah, it could be. I've heard, and you may know more about this than me, that people who are on the spectrum are very good at coding.
Yes, definitely.
So I don't know very much about that, but I know that some tech companies will actually look to recruit folks like that.
Yeah, because they like numbers. They
Yes.
like numbers, and so that is a good fit for them.
And they're very good at it.
Yeah.
The other thing is, I'd say, really consider working with a counselor, because if you've had that dyslexic label, you might be dealing with some trauma, because
Makes sense.
it is painful. And don't be afraid to talk with a professional about that, because life is only going to get easier and better by doing that.
Makes sense. Right on.
Yeah.
Okay, rapid fire question number 2.
Sure.
Someone who's being bullied right now in any form, what are you going to say to them?
You're going to have to stand up for yourself, because if you don't, this is going to go on for the rest of your life.
Any particular ways you suggest that they stand up for themselves?
That gets real controversial real fast. Yeah. You have the absolute right to defend yourself. And this is something I learned at sheepdog training. And it's not just the absolute right to defend yourself. You have the responsibility to defend yourself.
I know that's what someone like a Jordan Peterson would say, where there are some people out there, they just won't respect you until they know you have teeth.
Yes.
Until they know there will be some consequences to their actions.
Right.
And if there is no consequences, negative things can continue.
They're going to keep doing it.
Right. But when you have some assertiveness, you have some teeth, for lack of a better word,
right,
that can really do a lot to stop it. So I'm all for that.
Right. And I would never tell anybody how to do that in any given scenario. That's something that each person has to decide for themselves. But being trained to defend myself physically feels pretty darn good. And I think it prevents a lot of this.
Absolutely. I think there's just a way you carry yourself and a way you walk and the way you move that you can defend yourself. That gets sub-communicated. Like you communicate that to the world.
Yep.
Last question.
Yeah.
Someone is in a narcissistic relationship right now. What are you telling them? What are your suggestions for them?
The truth is, it's never going to get better. And the truth is that that person is really not capable of authentic love. Now, getting out, there are domestic violence support, there's the National Domestic Violence Support Line there. Get help. Get help before you leave. Reach out. And please, for God's sakes, let go of the shame. It doesn't serve you. But yeah, it's not going to get any better. It's just not. It's that person is incapable of being what you want them to be for you.
Right. I think that's important to note, is that the pain, there's not a value to it to hold on to it. It's more like letting it go, because it doesn't really serve people. It's similar to a resentment in the fact that it only hurts you when you hold on to it. And it's not to say it's not justified. Certainly can be justified for sure, but it just doesn't help. It just doesn't serve us at some point. So letting it go and getting to a thought process that helps you to let it go, I think that is huge.
And that's the healing journey. That takes time and it takes help. It's okay to ask for help.
I think that's a big one people struggle with.
Yeah. There's no shame in asking for help. We are not meant to live as isolated individuals. It's just not how we're wired.
Yeah, we're certainly community-oriented animals. That's for sure.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it very interesting, what this social media experiment is doing to our community-oriented brains and biologies and evolution. I don't know. They don't know what it's going to do. I'm sure it's having some sort of impact. They just don't know what it is yet.
And I think your word experiment is incredibly appropriate.
Yeah, well, that's what it is, right?
Yes.
I don't know. Who knows how it's going to turn out? The experiment might not turn out to be a success. I'm not sure.
Yeah, well, we're going to find out either way, right?
Yes, we will. Yes, we will. So any other closing thoughts that you wanted to share about anything we talked about today?
I guess the last thing I'd like to leave people with is, I've taken on this new way of living. And or I guess I've been doing it for a while, but wasn't necessarily conscious of it. And I love to get out there and be challenged, because that challenge creates growth, and that growth creates transformation. And then we just rinse and repeat.
So repeat that one more time. That's a good
Sure.
slogan.
Sure. So we get out, challenge yourself, find things, and like what Mark Divine would say, you got to get uncomfortable in an appropriate, safe manner. Well, a little,
Right.
just to cover that base. You get out there, you find an appropriate, safe challenge with good training, and you grow when you are challenged. And when you grow, you are transformed.
So challenges to grow to transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Similar to like the caterpillar to the butterfly kind of thing.
And then do it again.
There's always more layers to the circle. The circle will never end there.
Right. We're always growing and learning. So
absolutely. Well, Ellen, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. I enjoyed every bit of our conversation here and all the facets that we had. Her book, Disempowered, is it out yet, or will it be out soon?
It's out. It's on. You can find it on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, my webpage, which is just ellenbusch.com. And just don't forget the C in the Bush, because it's Bush like the beer, not the president.
That's a good distinction.
And everybody gets it.
Yeah, that right. And everyone who's watching this, they can see it on the screen there too, thankfully. So Bush with a C.
Yep. And thank you so much. I have so enjoyed this. This has been wonderful.
Like I said, it was a pleasure. Was mine.
Thanks again.
All right, Ellen. You have a great night. Thanks for watching, everybody. And till next time.